"Your farm is illegal," Karen shouted in my face, waving the HOA notice high in the air like it held absolute power. But I just smiled and pulled out the only gate key in existence. "Not anymore, Karen. I'm the one in control here. And this gate now belongs to me." Seeing her freeze in rage, I knew the war was over. No one was going to take away what I had built, not even power-hungry enforcers like the HOA. "What state are you in? Have you ever felt backed into a corner like I was? Share your story now." I was a man living with my wife and daughter in the Lakeside Heights neighborhood. Our life seemed peaceful, nothing remarkable. A small house between quiet street, inherited from my grandparent, was where Rachel and I built our home. Every morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside the window while Rachel prepared breakfast. We had a simple but filling life, a life I always believed would last forever. But everything changed when Rachel passed away. She had fought 3 years against a cruel cancer, but one day, she no longer had the strength fighting. I still remember that moment as if it happened just yesterday. Emily, our daughter, only 16 at the time, sat beside her mother's hospital bed, holding her thin hand. Rachel closed her eyes for the last time in our arms. Her death was a massive shock to me, not only because I had lost the love of my life, but also because I was now left with the responsibility of raising our daughter alone. Emily stayed silent, but I knew her pain ran far deeper than mine. We had to find a way to move through the grief, but I knew it wouldn't be easy. Every morning, I felt the emptiness of not hearing Rachel's voice, not seeing her making breakfast, not hearing her laugh. Emily, though strong, couldn't hide the emotional void left behind by her mother. In those early days after Rachel's passing, all Emily and I could do was hold on to each other in silence. We didn't know what to say or do, just slow, quiet steps through a house still full of Rachel's presence. I tried to give my daughter the most stable life I could. Even though sorrow lingered inside me, I had to be the strong one, so Emily would see that life still had to go on. I started taking her back to school, trying to bring back the rhythm of our old routine. During those months, no matter how hard I tried, the emptiness inside never fully left me. We decided to move to a new neighborhood, hoping it would help us start over. Lakeside Heights seemed ideal, quiet and safe community where I thought life might be easier again. The people seemed friendly, and the area was known for its beautiful homes, wide streets, and peaceful atmosphere, perfect for rebuilding after such a loss. When we moved into the new house, Emily seemed to gradually adjust to her surroundings. She spent most of her time focusing on school and joining community activities, though sometimes, I still saw that sadness in her eyes when she came home. I knew the pain of losing her mother wouldn't disappear overnight, but I hoped that time would help her heal. Everything started to change when I received a letter from the Homeowners Association. Contrary to the peace I had hoped for when moving into the Lakeside Heights neighborhood, that letter felt like a bucket of cold water thrown in my face. I opened it and read the dry, rigid lines about rules. I had never even heard of rules about paint colors, fence heights, and everything I considered normal when it came to maintaining a home. What was strange was that I had never been informed of these rules beforehand, nor could I recall receiving any notification from the HOA when we first moved in. Most of all, I couldn't understand why these regulations were being enforced so mechanically. The letter stated that my house violated the rule regarding exterior paint color. That alone irritated me, because I had repainted the house in a way I thought made sense and would not affect the community negatively. The HOA's demand that I correct everything within 30 days, along with a hefty fine, was something I couldn't ignore. I called to get more information, hoping for a reasonable explanation, but when I spoke to the HOA representative, she responded coldly, "Those are the rules, no exceptions." She didn't listen to a word I said, just repeated the same scripted lines over and over, making me feel like I was nothing, like I had no worth in their eyes. I began to realize that the rules imposed by the HOA weren't about protecting the community or maintaining order, but about controlling the residents on their own terms. These rules had no rational basis. They were arbitrary, unfair conditions that felt like traps designed to force residents into submission, with the threat of penalties, or worse if they didn't comply. I looked around the neighborhood, saw the other homes, longtime neighbors who never spoke up, figured maybe they had just gotten used to staying silent and accepting everything. But I couldn't stay silent like that. As I continued to read through the other regulations enforced by the HOA, I saw that they weren't just unreasonable, they were clearly discriminatory. New residents like me seemed to be the ones bearing the brunt of the harsh rules. Without any proper explanation or justification, I felt isolated, pushed into a system I never wanted to be part of. That sense of being manipulated by people who had no understanding of my life was something I simply couldn't accept. So what once seemed like a perfect neighborhood quickly revealed itself to be the start of a battle I never asked for. Not just a battle between me and the HOA, but a fight to protect my right to live freely, without being crushed by unjust rules and those who abuse their authority. I knew that if I wanted to live in peace here, I had to stand up and back against those who were trying to dismantle my life no matter how much power they claimed to have. This neighborhood, the place I once believed would be a peaceful start to a new life, has now become a battlefield, and I have no choice but to fight for what I rightfully deserve. Those rules, those discriminatory actions from the HOA, I will not let them destroy what I've built. My silence is over, and I will not allow this injustice to continue any longer. 1 week after receiving the first letter from the HOA, I got another notice, this time demanding that I change the exterior paint color of my house. The reason? It does not match the neighborhood's aesthetic. I held the letter, completely baffled. The color I chose was a neutral shade, not too bold, not too dull, just enough to blend harmoniously with the surrounding. What exactly didn't match? I couldn't find a single reasonable explanation for the demand. When I called the HOA hotline, the person in charge, a woman with an unmistakably cold tone, told me I needed to repaint the house within 30 days. If I didn't, I would be fined. No clear explanation, just a flat, "It's the rule." Whose rule? The rule of people who knew nothing about me or my situation? My frustration started to boil, and I realized this wasn't just about a paint color anymore. This was a form of unreasonable control that I could no longer quietly accept. It was at this point that I began to see that the HOA wasn't just managing minor guidelines, it was slowly encroaching on my property right. Karen, the HOA president, was asserting more and more authority, imposing increasingly strict demands. It wasn't just the paint, even the smallest elements of my garden became target. The trees I had planted, the low fences I loved, the flower beds that didn't meet some arbitrary design, all were suddenly violations. The feeling I had was one of deep irritation. I had lived here for years, built everything by hand, and now I was being micromanaged by people who didn't know me, who had no understanding of my life. Every time Karen showed up, she wore that stern expression like she was the only one entitled to make decisions. These senseless rules being enforced without any community input or consent. One day, while I was trimming the trees in my yard, Karen showed up with 2 other HOA members for an inspection. They criticized how I cared for the plant, saying it didn't meet the community standard. Then they told me I would need to replace the trees altogether because, in their words, these trees do not align with the overall aesthetic. I stood there silently, but inside, I was seething with a sense of insult I could no longer ignore. Karen looked me up and down, always smiling as if she was doing something noble. She constantly tried to maintain the image of a leader, the one protecting the values of this community. But what she was really doing was forcing control on people who had no way to fight back, and I realized I couldn't stay silent any longer. She didn't care whether I had the right to do anything on my own land. She believed her rules were absolute and that they must be followed without question. Each passing day, I felt like I was being pushed further into a corner. The rules and demands kept piling up, issued by a board I had never truly wanted to be part of. Everything from the paint color, to how I trimmed my trees, to how I arranged items in my yard, fell under their control. The things I did in the home I loved were gradually turned into offenses in their eyes, and I, a legal property owner, started to feel like a violator. I began to realize I could no longer live in silence. The people in the HOA, especially Karen, were tearing apart my life and making me feel as though I had no rights left on the land I had spent years building. I wasn't someone who gave in easily, but the arrogance and absurdity of the HOA made it clear that I couldn't allow them dictating my life. I had to stand up, had to do something to protect my right, even if it meant facing challenges far greater than I had anticipated. That sense of helplessness began to shift into determination. No one had the right to invade my life, and certainly no one had the right to decide how I should live on my own land. One weekend, I decided to spend some time tending to my garden, a space I had carefully nurtured over the years. The plants in that garden weren't just decorations, they were part of the memories tied to Rachel, to my family. I had chosen each species, each flower, so they would grow strong under my care. Still, those efforts couldn't escape the attention of the HOA. The next day, I received another notice from the HOA, demanding that I correct my garden. The reason was that the plants did not follow the community's standard. They said some were too large, others were planted in the wrong places, disrupting the uniformity they claimed was essential for the area. I looked at the plants I had grown and felt insulted. How could they make such demands when all I had done was care for the garden with intention, letting it grow naturally without disturbing the neighborhood's beauty? The plants hadn't damaged anything, they were living things like any other, and I couldn't understand how they could be treated as violations. Of course, I wasn't going to accept being fined, just because my garden didn't meet the standards of a board that had never even set foot in it. I wasn't someone who enjoyed blindly following unreasonable rules, but I also couldn't let them impose baseless demands on my life. I decided to speak up, push back. What made me even angrier was when I spoke with a few residents in the area, and they began voicing their support for me. They were frustrated with the HOA's rules, but lacked courage to confront Karen directly. I heard them speak with a worried tone, saying they knew I was fighting for my right, but they couldn't do the same because they feared retaliation, fines, or pressure from the HOA. They were afraid that if they stood up to Karen, there would be serious consequences for them and their family. This only deepened my disappointment. This community wasn't lacking in people with principles, they were simply being overpowered by the HOA, and fear had silenced them. Seeing all these longtime residents shake their heads and stay quiet made me even more determined. I couldn't allow myself to remain the oppressed one in a community where my rights were being violated so irrationally. If everyone here continued to stay silent, would the power of the HOA ever stop, or would it only grow stronger, tightening control over every person's life? I knew that if I didn't stand up and fight, I would never have the freedom I deserve. This community didn't belong to Karen or the HOA alone, it belonged to us, the people who lived and worked here. After several days of quietly digging into Karen Wellington and the Homeowners Association, I began to realize that things were not as simple as I had thought. The unreasonable demands and bizarre rules she imposed on residents were not just part of a typical HOA president's duties, they were part of a calculated strategy, a deliberate power game. Karen wasn't merely enforcing policy, she was running a covert real estate network right within the neighborhood I lived in, a shady business few could recognize at first glance. This completely changed how I saw what was happening around me. It was time to face the truth, no matter how harsh it might be. First, I didn't think much Karen. I assumed she was just a meddlesome HOA president who wanted to control everything in the neighborhood. The rules she enforced seemed like ordinary regulations from a board, things everyone had to follow to live in peace. But as I started digging into property transactions in the area, something began to feel off. Slowly, things became clearer. Longtime residents, especially those with limited financial resources, frequently fined for petty, unreasonable violations. After being hit with these penalties repeatedly, they could no longer afford to keep up and were forced to sell their homes at rock-bottom prices. It didn't surprise me when I discovered that most of these homes ended up in the hands of real estate companies linked to Karen. She wasn't buying property here out of love for the neighborhood, she was inflating its value and flipping it for profit, turning the entire area into her personal gold mine. As I continued to dig deeper, the truth became more disturbing. Every decision Karen made, every rule she enforced on us, wasn't about community interest, like she always claimed. Behind it all was a highly sophisticated strategy to acquire land and homes from financially struggling residents. She used unreasonable policies and impossible demands to push homeowners into giving up property for cheap. These homes weren't being listed due to minor infractions, they were being forced onto the market by the way Karen and her HOA manipulated the value of the land. I couldn't help but feel furious at this blatant manipulation, but I also couldn't deny that it was real. Karen wasn't just running the HOA, she was orchestrating a real estate network fueled by her ambition to expand her power and wealth. This made it impossible for me to sit back and do nothing. Karen always presented seemingly reasonable explanations when speaking to us, but I began to see that everything she said was just a facade for her own scheme. The demands about paint colors, fence height, and garden plants were never about protecting neighborhood value. They were tools to crush resistance and force financially vulnerable homeowners to sell their houses. She skillfully imposed regulations to put people into difficult positions, then took over their property for next to nothing. This wasn't just manipulation, it was abuse of power at the highest level. Karen wasn't simply running the HOA, she was executing a long-term strategy to acquire land and homes from struggling residents, inflate property values, and sell them at outrageous prices. The deeper I dug, clearer the terrifying web Karen had built became. The homes she bought weren't random acquisitions, they were part of a planned strategy from start to finish. She would buy property at dirt cheap prices, then allow the area to develop naturally, driving up land and housing value. After that, she would sell at inflated prices, raking in massive profits from her manipulative tactic. Every resident struggling financially, every person hit with endless fines for vague infractions, was a pawn in her game. These people had no idea they were being exploited, caught in a trap Karen had set long before they realized what was happening. I couldn't sit still and watch Karen carry out these plans. I couldn't let her continue to ruin this community and destroy everything I had built. I made up my mind that I wouldn't let it go on any longer. I had to protect my rights. I couldn't allow someone like Karen Wellington to keep manipulating the lives of innocent residents. I started finding ways to strike back, to plan a direct confrontation with Karen and the HOA board she controlled. It wasn't just about defending my own land anymore. I wanted to protect others from falling into the same trap. With the information I had gathered, I knew I had to act quickly and decisively. At this point, I was no longer someone who stayed silent. I would not let the HOA or Karen take away my ownership or anyone else's in this community. I would not allow someone like Karen to control our lives any longer. Do you feel like the HOA in your area is abusing its power? Have you ever experienced being forced to follow unreasonable rules or being manipulated like this? Share your thoughts in the comments. After spending a significant amount of time thoroughly studying property law and land ownership rights, I began to realize that the only way to stop Karen and the Homeowners Association from continuing their manipulation was to buy back the piece of land they were targeting. This land was not just where I had lived, built memories, and spent years of my life. It was the key to regaining control over my own. I knew that if the HOA continued to have influence over this land, I would not only lose the home I had worked so hard to build, but I would also lose a piece of my life. That land held deep meaning for me, tied to my past, my family, and my very existence in this community. Karen had grown far too arrogant, believing I would never be strong enough to fight back. She was certain I would crumble under the threats and senseless rules she imposed on the neighborhood. She was used to intimidating and manipulating people, assuming that everyone around her would accept it without resistance. But I could no longer allow myself to be oppressed. Owning that land was not just about personal rights, it was about protecting my family, especially the future of my daughter, Emily. She was the reason I had to fight with everything I had. So I made the decision that it was time to act. No more hesitation, no more second guessing. That land had to be mine, and I would do whatever it took to claim it, no matter what obstacles stood in my way. The next step was to find a way to finance this plan. The land that Karen and the HOA had set their sights on was incredibly valuable, not just in monetary terms, but as a strategic asset in Karen's eyes. She knew exactly what it was worth and would stop at nothing to get it. That meant I had to come up with enough money to buy it out from under the HOA, and that was no easy task. This land could either determine the course of my life or become the greatest financial challenge I had ever faced. So I started reaching out to banks and financial institutions to explore loan options and payment plans that could help me arrange funding in a reasonable way. At the same time, I had to carefully study local government policies and land ownership regulations to ensure that every step I took was legal and protected from obstruction. Every part of this plan had to be calculated because I understood that, if anything went wrong, it could all fall apart. Throughout this process, I couldn't help but dig deeper into the actions Karen had taken to manipulate the neighborhood. I began to uncover the tactics she had used to achieve her goals. One thing I discovered was that Karen wasn't just managing the HOA, she was actively pressuring residents in the area to sell their homes to her. Using coercion and intimidation, she exploited the HOA's unreasonable rules to make longtime residents feel insecure, financially stressed, and easily pushed into a state of fear. This gradually devalued the neighborhood's real estate. The homes of these residents no longer held their former worth because they were constantly being fined for minor infractions that Karen forced upon them. It was this very manipulation that allowed Karen to buy up properties at rock-bottom prices and slowly gain control over the area. A sense of disgust and anger rose in me as I uncovered the darkness behind Karen's actions. She wasn't just abusing the power she held through the HOA to control people's lives, she was hurting families who had lived in this neighborhood for years. She was forcing people to sell their homes, stripping them of their shelter for nothing more than personal gain. This wasn't just morally wrong, it was a violation of the basic rights of the people here. I couldn't stand by and watch this injustice without doing something. People like Karen couldn't be allowed to manipulate everything without facing any consequence. After gathering all the necessary information, I began putting together a detailed plan to take the next step. I didn't just need money to buy the land, I had to find a legal way to confront Karen and the HOA to force them to accept that things were going to change. This was a comprehensive strategy, not just financial but legal as well. I had made up my mind that I wouldn't let them continue to control my life for even one more minute. I started by reaching out to a real estate attorney, someone experienced and well-versed in matters of land ownership. I wanted to ensure every action I took was legally sound, with no loopholes that could cost me the land I had been preparing to reclaim. At the same time, I approached other residents in the neighborhood, those who had been pressured by the HOA or were struggling financially. I wanted them to know they weren't alone, that I would fight to protect everyone's right. To make sure this neighborhood didn't become the private property of a manipulator like Karen, I was ready to fight without stopping. It was time to act, no more waiting. This neighborhood didn't belong to Karen, and I would not let her continue to control the lives of mine, my family's, or anyone else's in this area. If I didn't stand up, if I didn't take action, Karen would keep doing whatever she wanted, and this neighborhood would become her possession. It could not happen. This land would be mine, and I would do whatever it took to take it back, no matter what challenges I had to face. I remember that morning clearly, when all the paperwork was finalized and I signed the last contract. In front of me lay the official documents confirming ownership of the land the HOA had once treated as a tool to control the community. Now it belonged to me. I didn't just hold the paperwork in my hands, I held the only key to the gate Karen once regarded as the symbol of her authority. The click of the key dropping into my palm gave me a feeling I had never experienced before, not just relief, but the deep satisfaction of knowing I had reclaimed the freedom that was rightfully mine. The decision to buy the land may have seemed reckless to some, but to me, it was the only way to prove the HOA could no longer manipulate. Every threat, every fine notice, every condescending glare from Karen no longer meant anything. I was no longer on the defensive, no longer worrying whether another warning letter would show up at my door tomorrow. I had taken back the upper hand, and that changed everything. Karen never saw this move coming. She always assumed I was just another busy middle-aged man, preoccupied with raising his daughter, with neither the time nor the nerve to stand up to her. But when she learned that the entire plot of land and the gate had been signed over to me, she was stunned. A neighbor happened to witness the moment and later told me that when Karen got the news, she dropped a stack of files to the ground. Face pale, mouth stammering, unable to form a word. To her, that gate wasn't just an entrance, it was a symbol of control, a shield she used to impose her authority on everyone. And now, it was gone. I still remember the moment I held the key, walked up to that gate, and opened it. The creak of the hinges sounded like the scream of broken chains. I stepped through, head held high, feeling the eyes of the residents around me. Some smiled, others only dared to glance, but I knew they all understood this was a moment unlike any the neighborhood had ever seen before. One person had stood up, had shattered the false power of the HOA, and had dared to confront Karen head-on. From that moment on, the balance of power shifted. The gate was no longer a tool Karen could use to intimidate people, no longer a card forcing residents to obey. It belonged to me, and with it, I could decide who passed, who stopped, and more importantly, I had stripped Karen of her most powerful weapon. She had once believed that locking that gate would keep everyone dependent on the HOA, convinced they couldn't live without her management. But I ended that illusion with a single signature and a single key. Karen reacted aggressively right after that. She brought a few of her loyal HOA members to the gate, shouting at me, accusing me of stealing community property. I didn't need to argue, I simply stood tall, pulled the key from my pocket, spun it once on my fingertip, and spoke clearly for everyone to hear, "This property now belongs to me under the law. If you want to challenge that, take it to court." The air was thick in that moment, but I saw the shock in many eyes. Karen was used to yelling in people's faces, but this was the first time she had been cut off by a truth she couldn't deny. In the days that followed, Karen repeatedly sent complaint letters, even threatening to sue, quietly read them all, then filed them neatly in a folder. My lawyer just laughed, saying they were nothing but baseless words with no legal standing. Karen had grown accustomed to using psychological tactics to intimidate, but now, without the gate in her hands, she had nothing left but empty pages. The community began to stir. People who had remained silent started whispering among themselves. Some even came to my door to shake my hand, thank me. They said that for the first time in years, they felt the HOA was no longer an unbeatable monster. I looked at them and saw the relief in their eyes, a relief long buried beneath fear. They were beginning to believe that if I could do it, maybe they could stand up for their own right too. For Emily, my daughter, this was also a significant moment. She had seen me frustrated countless times over the penalty notice, had watched me silently endure those humiliating HOA meetings. The day I came home holding the key, Emily looked at me with a brightness in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. She smiled and whispered, "You won, Dad." Her words caught me off guard. I realized I hadn't just fought for myself. I had fought for her, to show her that injustice should never be accepted as a natural part of life. The more I thought about it, the more I understood that what I did wasn't just a personal retaliation. It was a declaration to the entire community that Karen's manipulation couldn't last forever. By buying the land and the gate, I had dismantled the foundation of power Karen had spent years building. Of course, I knew she wouldn't surrender easily. Karen was the kind of person who would burn everything down before admitting defeat. But at the very least, I now had the upper hand, and I was ready for whatever came next. That night, as I stood on my porch, watching the soft glow of the street lamp fall across the familiar brick path, I felt a rare kind of peace. Not the artificial peace the HOA enforced by pressuring people to comply, but the peace of someone who knew they had reclaimed their freedom. I clenched key in my hand and smiled. In a world where people like Karen believe rules exist only to serve their ambitions, there's still room for justice. And I made a promise to myself this was only the beginning. Karen had lost what she considered her ultimate weapon, but I knew she would try everything she could to recover. As for me, I wouldn't back down. Once I had tasted victory, fear no longer held any power over me. I had learned that no matter how strong an abuser of power may seem, with determination and reason, we can break the chains they build around us. From that moment on, I had officially become the gatekeeper, both literally and figuratively, and that changed everything. The news that I had purchased the land along with the gate key spread faster than I expected. Within a few days, the entire Lakeside Heights neighborhood was buzzing. Some whispered in admiration, others watched cautiously, but everyone knew that Karen Wellington had just lost a critical piece of her power. Karen was not the kind of person to accept defeat. She was furious, and I wasn't surprised when, just a few days later, I received a 3-page notice from the Homeowners Association, stamped in bold red, declaring that I had committed a serious violation of community regulation and would face consequences. Karen was confident the letter would be enough to make me back down, but as I read the bitter lines, I saw nothing but a farce. She listed a series of absurd violations: trespassing on common property, improper use of land, all based on provisions that had long since expired. She tried to scare me with legal language, but I knew every word was just a thin layer of paint hiding her helplessness. I folded the letter and placed it carefully into the file I had already prepared as evidence of her blatant abuse of power. It didn't stop there. Karen began escalating. One afternoon, as Emily and I walked past the gate, I noticed a large new sign: residents prohibited from entering this area. Beneath it was Karen's signature, and the HOA seal. I laughed out loud. I was the legal owner, with documents and the only key in hand, yet she boldly declared I was banned from access. I stepped forward, pulled the key from my jacket pocket, inserted it into the lock, and opened the gate in full view of several neighbors nearby. The creak of the hinges echoed like a declaration. Karen's authority no longer held any weight here. Karen grew even more frantic when she saw that her tactics had failed to stop me. She held emergency board meetings, proposing extreme measures like installing surveillance cameras aimed solely at the gate, hiring security guards to block my access, and even petitioning local authorities to intervene. I knew none of it had any legal foundation. Karen understood that unless she responded aggressively, credibility within the HOA would collapse completely. She was gambling everything to cling to a power that no longer belonged to her. While Karen kept escalating, the community slowly began to see how unreasonable it all was. In the past, many had stayed silent, even avoided speaking to me for fear of HOA retaliation. But now, they saw with their own eyes that I had legal ownership, key in hand, and still Karen blatantly posted warning signs, sent threats, and devised schemes to obstruct. A neighbor named Mr. Peterson, who had lived here for nearly 30 years, came to my house, shook my hand firmly, and said quietly, "Put up with her for too long. You're doing the right thing. I'm with you." For the first time in months, I saw a resident openly express their support. Day by day, that support spread. Mrs. Gomez, who had once been fined for hanging flower pots in the wrong position on her front porch, whispered to Emily that seeing me take a stand made her feel like justice had finally been served. The Singh family, usually quiet and reserved, handed me a file they had for years, documenting the ridiculous fines they'd paid because their front door color didn't meet the so-called aesthetic standard. Those pieces of evidence only strengthened my belief Karen had truly crossed a line. I remember one evening, just after sunset, I stood on my porch and saw a group of neighbors gathered and talking. They no longer avoided my gaze. They spoke openly about the HOA's absurdity, about what Karen was doing, and for the first time, I heard questions voiced aloud. What else is she planning to do? Why are we letting her control everything? Is it time we fought back? Those questions sparked like flames touching dry straw, fueling the long smoldering discontent within the community. Karen didn't realize that her own anger was unraveling the image of power she had worked so hard to build. In the past, she had skillfully masked her authoritarian grip as preserving community value. But now, people watching her ban a legal property owner from his own land, seeing her put up absurd signs, hearing her rage out of control during meetings, that facade was cracking. Karen was slowly being seen for what she truly was, a greedy, arrogant person willing to trample anyone to keep her authority intact. I won't deny that during those days, I felt a stream of warning letters filled my mailbox, each one accompanied by steep fines. A few security guards were stationed near the gate, even though they had no authority to stop me. Emily asked me more than once if we were in serious trouble. I looked at her and replied firmly, "I have the law on my side, and we haven't done anything wrong." I wanted her to understand that no matter how many schemes surrounded us, we had to keep believing in justice. What kept me steady above all was the shift I saw in the community's eye, where once people lowered their heads as I passed, now they nodded in greeting, some even smiled. A silence that once meant complicity was turning into quiet solidarity. I knew Karen might still be aggressive, still have more trick, but she had already lost the most important thing, the unwavering support of the community. And once people start asking questions, the power of the HOA is no longer a solid wall. Late at night, as I sat in the living room with a folder of threat letters and absurd notices in front of me, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I knew the battle wasn't over, but I also knew I had taken the most important step, forcing Karen to reveal her true fate. I looked at the gate key resting on the table, glinting under the warm light, like a reminder that power doesn't belong to those who impose it, it belongs to those who dare to reclaim it. Karen could keep yelling in my face during meetings, keep sending dozens of penalty letters, and keep putting up as many prohibition signs as she liked. But in the eyes of the community, every one of those actions only confirmed that she had lost her grip. I didn't need to do much, just stay firm, hold my ground, and let Karen's own anger drag her into the pit she had dug for herself. This story, I believe, won't end here. There are still confrontations ahead, more schemes waiting. But right now, I've seen the turning point. Everyone sees that Karen has gone too far. And when a community starts asking questions, change becomes only a matter of time. The story of the gate and the land spread quickly, and I began to realize that from this point on, the community's attitude was shifting. People who once looked down, too shy to meet my eyes, were now openly standing beside me. They talked to each other more, exchanging stories that had previously been kept buried. I overheard whispers in the evenings around the porch, as small groups of residents gathered and shared their own experiences of being unfairly fined by the HOA. A sense of unity was growing out of shared outrage, fueled by witnessing Karen's increasingly blatant efforts to cling to power. Still, Karen showed no signs of backing looking down. She continued to appear at HOA meetings with a cold expression and a voice full of authority. She spoke as if she still held everything in her hands, as if my purchase of the land and the gate had been nothing more than a minor mishap. She issued decisions, signed documents, and sent out penalty notices like nothing had changed. I understood that for Karen, power was something she would never willingly give up, and seeing the community begin to side with me only made her more determined to prove she was the only one capable of keeping order here. While Karen scrambled to rebuild her image of troll, the residents began to speak publicly about what they had once hidden. Mrs. Gomez recounted being fined for hanging flowers on her porch, an act harmed no one. The Singh family shared evidence of the senseless penalties they had paid for years. Mr. Peterson told how he had been forced to replace his entire awning simply because it didn't meet the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. These stories were retold again and again, slowly becoming the spark that ignited the silence that had long blanketed Lakeside Heights. Karen, however, didn't let things unfold so easily. She tried to crush the voices of dissent by any means necessary. For every story that was shared, she sent a threatening letter. For every piece of evidence made public, she twisted the narrative, blaming residents for non-compliance. She made private calls to certain families, her tone a mix of sweetness and warning, as if reminding them the HOA always had ways of making life difficult. Some, out of fear, chose to remain silent, but many others began to see that their silence only made Karen stronger. At the next HOA meeting, Karen decided to attack me publicly in front of everyone. She stood up, holding a file in one hand, and spoke with deliberate force in her voice. "This man, Remiel Thornycroft, is disrupting our peace. He thinks he's above the rules, and if you let him go unchecked, he will drag all of us down with him." Many eyes turned toward me, but I didn't flinch. I sat up straight, met Karen's gaze, and saw the fury burning behind her eye. Karen didn't stop at criticism. She began using language laced with prejudice. She implied that I didn't belong here, that newcomers like me didn't understand the traditions of the neighborhood. She mocked the residents who stood with me, calling them traitors to community values. Even Emily, my daughter, had to hear Karen's cruel insinuations that I was unfit to raise a child, simply because I had dared to stand against the HOA. The community seemed to hold its breath. They had grown used to Karen's sarcasm and her use of authority to suppress dissent, but this time was different. This time, many had seen the truth. They saw that Karen was no longer using reason to defend her position, resorting to insult and discrimination to cling to power. And in the eyes of many, I no longer saw fear, I saw anger. I knew that if I chose silence now, everything I had done would mean nothing. This was no longer this was the moment I had to rise again, to face Karen directly in front of the entire community. I took a deep breath, stood up, and stepped into the center of the room. My voice rang out clear, unwavering. "I bought the land you used to control us. I have the document, I have the key, and I have the law on my side. Karen, how long are you going to keep hiding from the truth? How many families here have been unfairly fined? How many have lost their homes because of rules you created to feed your personal ambition?" The room fell silent. I saw Karen press her lips together, her eyes burning with anger. But this time, there were no approving nods, no clapping from the residents. They sat there, looking directly at her, waiting for an answer. Karen tried to regain her composure, but her voice lacked its usual force. She repeated her familiar lines about protecting community values, but even she knew those words no longer carried any weight. I ended with a single, firm sentence. "It's time we decide who truly represents community, a person who imposes, or all of us together, building this place with mutual respect." After that meeting, I returned home with a heavy heart, but no doubt in my mind. I understood that Karen wouldn't stop easily. She still had more schemes in store. But I also knew that this time, I was no longer alone. The community was waking up. They had seen Karen's true face, and I believed that their unity would be the fire that finally forced her to back down. The battle wasn't over, but I was ready to face it. Karen could pushing for control, could use every tactic to silence opposition, but I had made up my mind I would not back down. It was time to face Karen once more, not just for myself, but for everyone who had suffered too long under her rule. The HOA meeting that day was more crowded than usual. News that I had purchased the land along with the only gate key had sparked widespread curiosity. Some came to witness the confrontation, some hoped to see Karen brought down, and others simply wanted to see who would win the power struggle. I walked into the room, saw the neatly arranged rows of chairs, and felt the air tension. Karen was already there, standing at the front, clutching a folder, her face cold but her eyes unable to hide the anger. I stepped forward and sat in the seat designated for residents, but I knew I wasn't there to be judged. I had come to make a statement, to put an end to the long-standing falsehood. When the meeting began, Karen spoke first, her voice echoing through the room. She claimed that my actions had disrupted the community, that my ownership of the land and gate was an unauthorized seizure. I listened to every word, my hand resting calmly on the table, waiting for my turn. When I stood, every eye turned toward me. I looked directly at Karen, not flinching, and said clearly, I am the legal owner of that land. The HOA no longer has authority over it, and all the documents confirm that. Anyone who wants to see them, I can show them right here. My voice was steady, not raised, but every word landed with weight. A few murmurs spread through the back rows. I knew I had sparked curiosity. Karen immediately responded, stepping forward and pointing at me as she launched into her usual speech. She emphasized that I was a dissenter, a rule breaker, that if I was allowed to continue, the community's values would collapse. Those words had once carried weight, but today, I could see the uncertainty in several residents' eyes. There were no approving claps, no nods of agreement as before. Instead, they listened, waiting to hear what I would say next. I didn't let Karen drag it out. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a folder, and began presenting each page. I showed the land purchase contract, the legal ownership documents, all signed and certified by local authorities. Then, I turned to the next section, the evidence I had gathered on Karen's abuse of power. I presented the absurd fine notices received by numerous residents, all bearing the same phrasing, the same signature Karen. I even projected onto the screen a statement from a real estate company directly linked to her, revealing the shady connection between the HOA and her personal interest. The atmosphere in the room shifted visibly. Some residents began whispering to each other, a few nodded, and I saw Mr. Peterson turn to Mrs. Gomez and exchange a look of shared recognition. They had lived too long under Karen's control, and now, with the evidence in plain sight, they had no reason to remain silent. Karen turned red, trying to regain control of the meeting. She shouted that I was fabricating everything, that the documents were fake, that I was destroying the HOA's reputation. But the more she yelled, the more her panic showed. People could see clearly that Karen no longer had the calm composure she once used to dominate the community. I calmly responded, "If you believe I'm lying, then let's take it to court. The law will decide." That statement struck like a blade against the wall of power Karen had built over the years. The room fell silent for a second, then whispers began to rise. I knew the balance of power had started to shift. People no longer feared Karen, they were beginning to see her as someone desperately clinging to a crumbling seat of authority. Everything reached its peak when I invited a few residents to stand and share their experience. Mrs. Gomez spoke of being forced to remove her flower trellis simply because it didn't match the color scheme. Mr. Peterson recalled being threatened with a fine 3 times the actual cost if he didn't replace his awning. The Singh family presented a notice they had received for letting their child play in the yard at night, a laughable excuse. These stories, once hidden in shame, were now spoken aloud, leaving Karen with no way out. The room grew louder as more people demanded that the HOA reconsider its practices. Some openly stood with me, calling for a confidence vote right then and there. Karen tried to hold her ground, but I knew she had already lost the psychological battle. In the eyes of the residents, I no longer saw doubt, I saw trust. Trust in me, in what I was doing, in the belief that together, we could end this cycle of abuse. Finally, I ended my presentation with a firm statement. I didn't come here to destroy anything. I came to reclaim justice for myself, and for all of us. If someone like Karen remains in control, how many more families will suffer under this injustice? That question hung in the air, heavy as a hammer falling. The meeting ended in chaos. Karen stormed out, her face flushed, unable to say another word. Many residents came forward to shake my hand, some even hugged me as if releasing years of silent frustration. I knew I had just won this battle of wills. Karen no longer held absolute power, and more importantly, she had lost the support of the community. That night, I sat at my desk with the stack of documents that had become my weapon against Karen. I thought about the journey, those first penalty letters, the long silence, and finally, the direct confrontation. I understood clearly that patience, determination, and belief in justice had brought me to this day. But I also knew this wasn't the end. Karen wouldn't give up easily, she would find a way to strike back. I had to stay ready, not just for myself, but for the entire community, now placing their trust in me. As I looked out the window, the streetlight cast its glow on the empty road, and I knew I had just stepped into a new chapter. From this moment on, Lakeside Heights would never be the same. Karen might try to strike back, but she would never regain the support she had lost. I had proven that even one person, though oppressed, could rise up and break the chains using truth and courage. And this was only the beginning of real change. What do you think about an individual standing up against the abuse of power by an HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. After the fateful meeting, Karen disappeared for a few days, but I knew it wasn't surrender. She had never been the type to relinquish power easily, and silence was simply a sign that she was preparing another strike, a more calculated scheme. I didn't have to wait long to see it. The following week, I received a letter from the HOA, written in their familiar tone but with far more aggression. They demanded that I voluntarily relinquish ownership of the land, claiming that an individual holding the gate key posed a threat to community security. I read the letter and laughed. Community security had never truly been Karen's concern. concern. What she wanted was to restore the control she had lost. I knew that since losing command of the gate, Karen had no tool left to force the residents into submission, so she now aimed to cast me as a menace. But this time, I didn't feel the same anger. I folded the letter, slipped it into the increasingly thick file, and treated it as further evidence of abuse of power. Karen didn't stop there. She launched a campaign unlike anything I had seen before. She began distributing weekly newsletters to every household, claiming I was uncooperative, defiant, and divisive. She cherry-picked details, blew them out of proportion, and painted me as a selfish man willing to sacrifice the common good for personal pride. Within weeks, the HOA newsletter was filled with personal attack. She even dragged Emily into it, claiming I was pulling my daughter into unnecessary trouble, that a decent father wouldn't behave this way. At first, I felt unsettled, as the campaign caused some residents to hesitate. Few looked at me with uncertainty, perhaps because they had never seen anyone openly defy the HOA. But I knew the truth was on my side. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't send rebuttals or explanation. Instead, I kept working with my attorney, combing through documents, collecting testimonies from residents who had also been bullied. Karen. Each night, after Emily went to bed, I sat at my desk and laid out all the papers, land deeds, receipts of unfair fines, threat letters, defamatory newsletters, all meticulously organized into separate files. I was no longer thinking only of myself. This had become a legal battle I knew would eventually happen, and when it did, Karen would have nowhere left to hide. The community began to see the truth. As the smear letters piled up, they started to backfire. Some residents recalled they, too, had been targets of similar tactics when Karen needed an excuse to penalize them. Mrs. Gomez told me that when she resisted being forced to replace her entire porch, Karen labeled her a threat to community values. The Singh family remembered being accused of failing to assimilate simply for keeping a few personal traditions in their backyard. Those memories stirred something. They began to awaken. One afternoon, as I was watering the plants, Mr. Peterson walked over and said plainly, "I read what Karen wrote, and I saw myself in there, back when she forced me to replace my awning. You're not wrong. She's just using the same old trick." That one sentence made something crystal clear to me. The cracks in Karen's campaign were beginning to show. People were starting to realize that anyone who stood up to the HOA was turned into an enemy in the eyes of the community. And that was exactly how Karen maintained her grip on power. Day by day, those who once lived in fear began to speak out. They no longer stood in the shadows. They whispered to one another, then gradually started sharing their stories openly. At a small gathering in the local church, few residents boldly stated that the HOA no longer represented the collective good. I attended that meeting, listening quietly, and my heart swelled when Mrs. Gomez said, "If Remiel hadn't had the courage to stand up, we would have kept our mouths shut. But now, I don't want to stay silent anymore." Karen couldn't silence all those voices. She tried, with new letters and subtler threats, but the pressure from the community wasn't the same. When I walked down the main road, a few residents came up to shake my hand. They didn't need to say much. The look in their eyes told me all I needed to know. Trust was beginning to shift in my direction. Still, I remained cautious. I knew Karen wouldn't stop with her media campaign. She would find any way to regain control, maybe even countersue me. Maybe rally board members to push back. But this time, I had the community behind me. I was no longer one person fighting an entire system. I was the voice of years of bottled-up frustration, and I was ready to see this through. As night fell and the house grew quiet, I sat staring at the gate key resting on the table. It was no longer just a personal symbol. It was a sign of change, of the determination shared by a community desperate to break free from Karen's grip. I knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but one thing was certain: I wasn't going to stop. Karen might continue to throw every trick she had, but with each move, she was exposing more of who she truly was. And once the community fully saw it, there would be no going back. Lakeside Heights would change, and I would make sure that change happened to the very end. I thought that after her smear campaign failed, Karen would step back and try to salvage what was left of her image. But for someone like her, failure has never meant stopping. Karen chose a different path, one far more blatant, and this time she used the entire HOA machinery to turn her schemes into official policy. I started finding new notices in my mailbox, freshly issued regulations, all carrying the same familiar tone: strict, authoritarian, and so absurd they were almost laughable. Karen and the board introduced a wave of supplemental rules, most of them directly targeting those who had supported me or spoken out against her. Claimed it was to preserve uniformity, mandating that every porch painted the same approved color chosen by the HOA. Anyone who didn't comply would be fined. They ordered that all signs, even small nameplates at the gate, must be submitted for approval. They declared that any gathering within the community, including simple backyard family barbecues, had to be reported in advance. These rules weren't designed to protect property value, as they claimed. They were crafted to suffocate dissent, prove that the HOA still held absolute authority. I could see the mock mockery in every line. Karen was trying to turn the residents' daily lives into a maze of paperwork and regulation, exhausting anyone who dared to resist. It all came to a head when the HOA issued a new directive requiring every resident to pay a community development. In the announcement, Karen wrote that the fee would be used to enhance property value and ensure Lakeside Heights remains the region's most desirable neighborhood. But everyone knew it was a trap. The fee wasn't small, and it would be charged quarterly, essentially a tax the HOA had decided to impose on its own. The first to come to me was Mr. Peterson. He held the notice in his shaking, aged hands, eyes burning with anger. "I've lived here 30 years and never once paid for nonsense like this. Does she think we're some kind of cash machine?" I looked at him and knew his outrage wasn't just personal. Elderly residents, middle-income families, this fee would crush them all. I decided I wasn't going to give in. I couldn't let the HOA turn living in this neighborhood into an extortion racket. I spent several days poring over state real estate laws and homeowners association statutes. I found a clear provision. Any new fee imposed on residents must be approved by a vote, with a majority in agreement. The HOA had conducted no vote, only sent out a notice, and assumed compliance. That was their weak, and I knew I could use it to strike back. I scheduled a meeting with my attorney, laid out all the documents and the notices issued by the HOA. He flipped through each page, nodding, then smiled and said, "You have a very strong case. This is an overreach of authority, and if we take it to court, the HOA will be held accountable." Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting off my chest. I was no longer just defending myself, I had the legal grounds to strike back. While I was preparing, Karen kept pushing hard to convince the other residents that the new fee was necessary. She held a meeting in the community hall, standing tall on the stage, waving around a financial report no one could decipher. She claimed the fee would be used to renovate the park, upgrade security, and add new amenities. But many residents were already waking up. They remembered past instances when the HOA collected money with no resulting improvement. They remembered the baseless fine, the decisions that only served Karen's personal interest. At that meeting, I stood up and asked Karen a simple question. "Why haven't you held a vote? Why did you unilaterally impose this fee?" Karen faltered, her eyes betraying a flash of unease, then quickly replied, "The board has agreed." But the crowd began murmuring, because everyone knew the board consisted of Karen's close allies and didn't represent the community at large. After the meeting, I saw people lingering to talk. Mrs. Gomez whispered that she no longer trusted Karen. The Singh family openly stated they wouldn't pay a cent until a vote was held. Even those who had remained neutral were starting to ask questions. The harder Karen tried to justify her actions, the more clearly the community saw through her. I continued collecting resident testimonies, recording every story, every frustration. I knew that when the time came, I would have a case file ready for court. But more importantly, I could feel the shift in the community. People no longer flinched at the mention of the HOA. They were talking, questioning, and speaking out. Some even said that if I chose to sue, they would testify on my behalf. Karen didn't seem to realize that the more she tightened her grip, the more her greed and authoritarian nature became visible, and that visibility, day by day, was costing her the very support she had maintained through fear for so long. I knew this battle would be a long one, but I also knew I had the upper hand. The HOA could continue abusing its power, but the more it did, the deeper it dug its own grave. That night, I sat in the living room, staring out the window at the quiet street. Emily sat beside me, holding the documents I had just organized, her eyes filled with worry. "Dad, is this going to end?" she asked softly. I placed a hand on her shoulder and replied, "It will, but not in silence. It'll end when justice speaks." That wasn't just to comfort Emily, it was a promise to her, to myself, and to the entire community of Lakeside Heights that I would not stop until Karen and the HOA were held accountable for their blatant abuse of power. I thought long and hard before making the decision. After all the threatening letters, the absurd regulations, and the fabricated fees, I realized that confronting Karen and the HOA only through public meetings and verbal arguments would never be enough. They were used to ruling with power, used to manipulating an entire community through pressure and control. I couldn't wait for them to admit fault, and I couldn't keep fighting back alone. The only way forward was to bring everything into the light of the law. I had to file a lawsuit against the HOA, not just to protect my own right, but to finally break the cycle of injustice that had gone on far too long in Lakeside Heights. That decision wasn't easy. I knew that suing an organization with a legal apparatus, a budget, and people willing to do anything to stay in power would feel like going up against a brick wall. But I also knew the law placed limits on abuse of authority, and Karen had crossed those limits many times. What I needed was someone knowledgeable and fearless to walk this path with me. I began searching for a lawyer who specialized in real estate and property rights, someone with experience taking on organizations like HOAs. A former friend of mine who had worked in the legal field field, referred me to a name, Charles Donovan, an attorney with over 20 years of experience in this area, known for winning multiple lawsuits against homeowners associations across the state. I researched him, read articles and case files tied to his name, and the more I read, the more my confidence grew. This was the person I needed. I called his office, scheduled a meeting, and prepared every relevant document I had. On the day I met Charles, I brought an entire suitcase full of paperwork, from land purchase contracts, ownership documents, receipts for absurd fines, smear newsletters, to dozens of threatening letters from the HOA. Everything was sorted and clearly labeled. Charles was a man with graying hair, sharp eyes, and a calm, steady voice. He flipped through each page, occasionally raising an eyebrow, occasionally nodding. After nearly an hour of review, he looked up at me and said slowly, "You have a solid case. They've clearly exceeded the limits of HOA authority, and this evidence is enough to take them to court. If you're ready, I'll help you build a legal strategy." I felt a new surge of strength run through me. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. From that moment on, Charles and I began our work. He guided me on how to collect testimony from other residents, how to document every action taken by the HOA, even the smallest detail. He explained that in court, the strength of a lawsuit doesn't come only from major evidence, but from the accumulation of countless minor details, forming a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse of power. We developed a strategy. First, we would file a lawsuit against the HOA for violating personal property rights and abusing authority in its administration. At the same time, we prepared a case to challenge the so-called community development fee Karen had unlawfully imposed. Charles also suggested expanding the lawsuit into a class action if enough residents were willing to join, because he believed many had also been victims, just too afraid to speak up. Hearing that, I realized this battle had moved far beyond the personal. This was an opportunity for the entire community to break free from Karen's grip. I began sharing information about the lawsuit with my close neighbors. First, some were hesitant, afraid that if Karen found out they supported me, they'd face consequence. But when I showed them the documents, when I told them I had a professional attorney by my side, I saw the fear in their eyes begin to fade, placed by a glimmer of hope. Mrs. Gomez held my hand tightly and said, "If you can really get her into court, we'll testify. We've stayed silent for years, but it's time to speak up." Mr. Peterson said he was ready to recount the whole story of being forced to replace his awning at an outrageous price. The Singh family confirmed they would provide every penalty letter they had received, keeping their cultural traditions. Gradually, others came to me too, sharing the injustices they had faced. They were no longer whispering in the shadows. For the first time, I saw this community truly united by a common goal: to end the abuse of power. Charles organized a private meeting at his office, where I brought 10 other residents. He sat there, listening carefully to each story, taking notes with precision. When the meeting ended, he said something that made all of us feel lighter. "What I've heard today is not just injustice, but a deeply entrenched pattern of abuse. This lawsuit isn't just about protecting one person. It's about ending the cycle for an entire community. You're not alone." News that I had filed a lawsuit against the HOA spread quickly, and surprisingly, instead of being isolated, I received overwhelming support. People who used to stay silent now started talking to me, sharing their stories, even asking if they could join the lawsuit. I saw the change in their eyes from fear to belief. They believed we could win, that justice was no longer out of reach. Karen, of course, didn't stay idle. When she learned I had filed, she sent even more threatening letters, claiming I was undermining the community's reputation. But this time, those letters no longer made the residents tremble. On the contrary, they became living proof of the abuse we were fighting. Every letter the HOA sent, I made a copy, added it to the growing file, and treated it as another brick in the wall, protecting our case. I remember one afternoon, as Emily and I sat on the porch, she looked at me and asked, "Dad, are you sure we're going to win?" I was silent for a moment, then replied, "I don't know what the outcome will be, but I'm certain of one thing: we're doing the right thing, and the right thing is always worth fighting for." Emily nodded, her eyes full of trust. I knew I wasn't just fighting for the community, but for my daughter, so she would see that justice is something worth standing up for. The lawsuit hadn't begun, but the spirit of the community had already. The quiet conversations on sidewalk, the firm handshake, promises to testify, all of it formed a growing strength. I knew the road ahead would be long and full of challenges. For the first time in many months, I saw a light at the end of it. Karen might still resist, the HOA might still lash out, but we had the law, we had unity, and we had resolve. And those were things Karen could never control. I clenched my hand around the gate key in my pocket, feeling the cold of the metal. To me, it was no longer just proof of ownership. It had become a symbol of the legal battle ahead, where I and the entire community would rise together unbowed, unafraid, and absolutely unwilling to back down. I knew very well that once the lawsuit was officially underway, Karen would never simply sit back and watch everything slip from her grasp. She was the kind of person who grew more aggressive the moment her authority was challenged, always looking for new ways to crush her opponent. Sure enough, it wasn't long before I started noticing new tactics at play. No longer just warning letters or penalty notices. This time, Karen shifted her strategy and began using the community itself as a weapon against me. The first move was veiled threat. A few residents told me they had received letters from the HOA with an unusual tone. The contents implied that if they publicly supported me in the lawsuit, they might face fines or increased scrutiny regarding their homes and yards. Clearly, Karen was trying to sow fear and force them into silence. Some people began to wonder whether they should continue standing by me. But what Karen didn't expect was that this blatant abuse only fueled more anger among the residents. Karen then escalated the attack by launching a disinformation campaign. In the monthly HOA newsletter, she dedicated an entire section to writing about me. She portrayed me as a troublemaker, claiming I only wanted to disrupt community order and had no respect for shared rules. She even dragged Emily into it, suggesting that I was dragging my entire family into chaos and that no decent father would behave this way. Her words weren't just defamatory, they were personal attack, calculated to destroy my image in the eyes of the neighborhood. Still, I wasn't shaken. I had anticipated this long ago, and Charles, my attorney, had warned me, let them expose themselves. The more falsehoods they publish, the more evidence we have of their intent to defame, and the stronger our case becomes. I followed his advice and stayed calm. I didn't respond with defensive arguments or emotional outbursts. Instead, I kept working, gathering evidence, kept meeting with residents. I wanted people to see that I was steady, transparent, and unafraid of any accusation. As Karen tried to paint me as a rebel, the community had a chance to compare what they read with what they saw. They saw me going to work, taking care of Emily, keeping my property neat, and, more importantly, always treating others with respect. Meanwhile, Karen began to unravel. Her words in the newsletter grew increasingly spiteful, even openly discriminatory. In one instance, she wrote that newcomers need to learn to adapt rather than try to change this community. Everyone knew exactly who she was targeting me, and the families who didn't share the same skin color or background as the longtime resident. It was that very discrimination that awakened many. Some residents, who had previously stayed silent, began to speak up. During a small meeting, Mr. Peterson stood up and said bluntly, "We can't call someone a troublemaker just because they want to be treated fairly. If this is how the HOA defines community values, then I want no part of them." His words were met with widespread agreement. Mrs. Gomez shared that she had once been fined by Karen for hanging patriotic flags during a holiday, and now she saw clearly that Karen was recycling the same tactics against me. The more people spoke out publicly, the more unhinged Karen became. She issued even more violation notices, some so absurd that residents scoffed openly. The Singh family was ordered to remove their patio set because it was deemed aesthetically non-compliant. Another resident was warned simply for planting a few flower bushes not listed on the HOA's approved vegetation list. These irrational actions no longer inspired fear, they became living proof that the abuse of power had gone too far. I could see the wave of outrage rising. At a community meeting, when Karen stood up and declared that I was dividing the neighborhood, several voices shouted back. One person yelled, "We're more united than ever, but united against you." Karen froze for a moment, stunned that her manipulation had finally been publicly challenged. Though she tried to maintain a firm front, Karen's threats grew increasingly illogical. She began citing rules she had clearly written herself, with no legal foundation. She claimed residents could be suspended from benefits if they disagreed with the HOA, but everyone knew that suspended from benefits was a term she had invented. Some people laughed aloud right in the meeting, leaving Karen red-faced and visibly flustered. I sat quietly, watching it all unfold, and saw clearly that the tide was turning. Fear that once silenced the community was being replaced with outrage and courage. They no longer saw me as a lone dissenter standing up to the HOA. They saw me as someone who had opened the path, and now they were following. Karen's discriminatory threats, instead of dividing the community, had inadvertently brought us closer together than ever before. That evening, back at home, I sat on the porch, watching Emily beaming with joy. She said, "Dad, I heard Mrs. Gomez say that because of you, they finally had the courage to speak up. I'm proud of you." I smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. I knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but the more Karen tried to intimidate, the more she exposed her own weakness, and I had no reason to stop. Karen wanted me to abandon the lawsuit, but everything she did only strengthened my resolve. I had started this fight to protect my own rights, but it had become a fight for the entire community. And I understood that when a community stands together, no abuser of power can stand for long. Tensions in the neighborhood reached a boiling point, as Karen's discriminatory rhetoric and blatant abuses of power became more outrageous. A community that had simmered with quiet frustration for years now felt pushed to its absolute limit. No one wanted to pretend anymore that these were just ordinary administrative rules. People began to see the true nature of the HOA, a machinery of oppression led by Karen, where authority was weaponized to serve personal interest. Families who had once stayed silent could no longer endure. Whispers of discontent turned into open conversations, and then into acts of resistance. I noticed the change in small detail. People no longer avoided my gaze when passing by. They began to stop, greet me, and exchange brief words about the situation. One day, Mrs. Gomez came to my house, her voice trembling but resolute, telling me that she and a few neighbors had held a private meeting to share their story, and they wanted me to join. I nodded immediately. I knew this was the first signal of an uprising. These secret meetings place in residents' living room, sometimes in Mr. Peterson's basement, other times in the Singh's garage. There were no minutes taken, no official announcements, just plastic chairs arranged in a circle, and eyes filled with hope. People recounted stories they had kept hidden. A middle-aged man was fined so harshly by Karen for a parking violation that he had to sell his old car. An elderly woman was forced to replace her windows because they weren't the approved color. The Singh family spoke of the discrimination they faced when the HOA publicly shamed them for maintaining their cultural tradition. As each story was told, the room seemed to grow heavier, filled with the weight of long-suppressed emotions rushing out all at once. There was frustration, outrage, but above all, a desire to act. I listened, then shared what I had gathered: evidence of unauthorized fees, threatening letters. I told them my lawsuit could become a class action if enough people came forward. Their eyes lit up, no longer filled with hesitation, but with the belief that this time, they wouldn't be alone. We began planning for a public HOA meeting. The goal was to expose Karen's illegal actions in front of the entire community, with everyone present to witness it. My attorney, Charles Donovan, and I meticulously reviewed the document, assembling a file of unreasonable fine receipt, defamatory newsletters, and signed witness statements from residents. Charles reminded me, what matters isn't just the evidence, it's building consensus. You need to make them see this truth belongs to everyone, not just you. In the nights leading up to the meeting, we gathered frequently. Mr. Peterson volunteered to deliver the opening remark, speaking about the years he had lived under the HOA's stranglehold. Mrs. Gomez prepared to recount being forced to dismantle her holiday trellis. The Singh family drafted their statement detailing the times Karen had publicly discriminated against them. I would present the legal evidence, compiling the case so thoroughly that no one could deny it. Karen, of course, was not oblivious to what was happening. I heard whispers that she had begun holding private meetings with neutral residents, trying to persuade or intimidate them with warnings that supporting me would mean losing their community privileges. But those threats no longer held any weight. People murmured among themselves Karen was losing control, that she was afraid. I remember one rainy afternoon, walking along the main road, I saw Karen talking to a few residents. Her voice still rang out loudly, trying to argue that everything I was doing was madness. But I could see clearly that the people listening no longer bowed their heads like they used to. They nodded politely, then walked away, no longer showing deference. Karen noticed it too, and for a brief moment, I caught a flicker of unease in her eyes. As the day of the public meeting approached, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted completely. Small groups gathered more frequently. People no longer feared the HOA to the point of holding their breath. They started discussing who would speak, who would testify. I could feel a new wave rising. Those who had once stayed silent, who had once endured, were now ready to confront. I knew Karen could feel her grip slipping. Every move, every word she spoke was under scrutiny. Each time she issued an HOA newsletter, people no longer believed her rhetoric. They read it as further evidence of her growing desperation. The more she tried to tighten her hold, the more clearly the community saw who she really was. In the quiet nights leading up to the meeting, I often sat in the living room with Emily. She asked, "Dad, are you sure they won't be afraid anymore?" I looked into her eyes and replied, "Fear doesn't last forever. Eventually, people realize that unity is stronger than fear." Emily smiled, and for the first time since this all began, I think truly felt at ease. As the official meeting day neared, I no longer felt like a lone individual fighting a battle. Felt like part of a community slowly awakening after years of suffocation. Karen had lost her most powerful weapon, the fear that once gripped every resident's heart. And when that fear turns into anger, into resolve, nothing can save her fabricated authority. Have you ever believed that the power of a community can change everything? Share your thoughts on standing up against abuse of power. The day I officially filed the lawsuit against the HOA, there was a heaviness in my chest. I knew that once I took this step, there would be no turning back. In the complaint, I asked the court to review the entire pattern of power abuse, from unjustified fees to unlawful penalties, and to grant damages for the harm that I and other residents had suffered. More importantly, I demanded that the HOA be held accountable for the systemic racial discrimination that Karen had long hidden behind the guise of preserving community value. I still remember the exact moment the lawsuit was stamped and received. I looked at at it, feeling both anxious and relieved. This was no longer a heated argument. In a tense meeting, it was the truth laid before the scales of justice. I knew Karen wouldn't sit quietly, and sure enough, days later, the HOA released a statement denying all allegations, calling my lawsuit defamatory and a deliberate attempt to undermine the community. But I no longer paid attention to their words. I had prepared meticulously every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every small detail had been organized into a solid case file. The legal battle began, and it escalated more quickly than I had expected. Karen hired an aggressive legal team, experts in manipulation and delay tactics, filed repeated motions to dismiss, aiming to derail the case. They argued everything from my alleged lack of authority to represent the community to claims that all HOA decisions were valid under the existing charter. But Charles Donovan, my attorney, remained calm. He pointed to the evidence we had, copies of absurd fines, board actions never voted on by residents, and defamatory newsletters. He said, "We don't need to shout, we just need the truth." Karen, of course, kept up her confident facade during the hearing. She sat across the room, arms folded, eyes scanning as if she still controlled the narrative. But I saw the tension in every blink. She knew she couldn't keep the mask on much longer. The residents had begun to side with me. One by one, they volunteered to testify, to share their stories in court. Mr. Peterson was the first. He recounted being coerced into replacing his awning at 3 times the real cost, under threat of forced compliance. His voice trembled, but every word echoed through the courtroom. Mrs. Gomez followed, describing how she was fined simply for hanging flowers on a holiday. The Singh family stood and gave a clear account of the discriminatory remarks they had heard directly from Karen during HOA meeting. These testimonies were no longer isolated incidents, they formed a cohesive picture of how the HOA had become a weapon in the hands of one individual. I remember the moment when Karen's attorney tried to discredit the Singh family's testimony, asking if there was any audio or video evidence. Singh answered firmly, "The evidence is our experience, and it's not just ours, many people here heard it. We are no longer afraid." The room fell silent for a moment, then claps came from the rows of residents. The judge struck the gavel and called for order, but I knew deep down, this psychological battle was beginning to turn in our favor. Karen started to show visible crack. In one hearing, when asked why the community development fee had been imposed without a vote, she tried to deflect, claiming the board had agreed. The judge followed up, "Is there any proof that residents voted?" Karen went quiet, eyes downcast, mumbling something inaudible. It was the first time I saw her unable to hide. The community began to understand. Those who were once neutral, who had assumed this was just a personal dispute between Karen and me, now saw how her actions had affected everyone. A group of younger residents created an internal website where they posted updates on the case and shared public documents. Every day, more people joined the discussions. What Karen had tried so hard to keep in the dark was now being dragged into the light. I remember one afternoon while walking with Emily, a young couple approached, shook my hand, and said they were grateful I had stood up. The husband said, "We used to think the HOA was something you couldn't fight, but you've shown us that justice is possible, as long as someone takes the first step." Those words lifted a weight off my shoulders, because I knew that what I was doing wasn't just for my own family, but for future generations in this community. The more Karen tried to retreat, the more the truth came out. The HOA's financial records, once reviewed, revealed suspicious spending, with missing receipts and vague allocations. Some maintenance contracts were signed with a company run by one of Karen's relatives. These details prompted the judge to expand the scope of the investigation, pushing Karen and the board further into a corner. In a final hearing of the preliminary trial phase, Charles stood and said, his voice steady, "This is not just about one person being wrongly fined or one unauthorized fee. This is about a community run by autocracy, where rules are twisted to serve personal ambition. This is no longer a matter of property values. It is a matter of justice and human dignity." His words cast a heavy silence over the room. I looked at Karen and saw her face flush, her lips pressed tight. The legal battle was not yet over, but from that moment on, I knew Karen had no way out. Every move, every word she spoke, was under scrutiny. The community was no longer just listening, they were watching. They now understood that the person they had allowed to hold power for years was, in truth, someone who had abused that position for personal gain. When I got home that day, Emily ran out and hugged me, asking, "Dad, does this mean we're about to win?" I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her and said, "What matters is that we've brought the truth to light. Winning is only a matter of time now." She smiled, and in her eyes, I saw the spark of hope that the HOA had tried so hard to extinguish in this community. Karen wasn't exposed by a single moment, but by a tapestry of truths stitched together. Every resident's testimony, every financial document, every threatening letter, each piece, paint the portrait of someone who had abused power beyond denial. And that, more than anything, the community finally understand after years of being suppressed. The legal battle still had a long road ahead, but I could already see the outcome. The truth was no longer hidden, and justice, though late in coming, was steadily making its way toward us. As the lawsuit officially entered its critical phase, I noticed the anxiety etched clearly across Karen's face every time she appeared in court. She no longer carried the arrogant confidence she once wore, replaced instead by uneasy glances and evasive answers. The evidence Charles Donovan and I presented grew increasingly airtight, from questionable financial documents to witness testimonies from residents. Karen knew the balance had tipped, and the truth about everything she had done could no longer be concealed. Then, just as I predicted, when she saw there was no chance of winning, Karen played her final card. She threatened to countersue me. During a public meeting, she stood up, voice shrill, declaring that I was damaging the HOA's reputation, that my accusations were merely an attempt to fill personal agendas, and that she would file a lawsuit to seek damages for defamation. The room erupted in whispers, but unlike before, no one lowered their eyes at her threat. Some even laughed derisively, knowing full well Karen was only flailing in desperation. I sat still, directly at her, and calmly said, "The HOA's reputation hasn't been damaged by me. It's been damaged by your own misconduct and discrimination. If you want to countersue, I'm ready, and the court will decide who's telling the truth." The room fell silent. Karen stood frozen for a few seconds, then quickly gathered her papers, avoiding everyone's gaze. The truth was, by then, the residents were fully on my side. They no longer feared threat, nor did they believe in Karen's tact. After months of witnessing the entire process, they understood that the one who had undermined the community wasn't me, but the HOA under Karen's control. In private meetings, residents openly voiced their support, saying that if Karen dared to countersue, they would gladly testify against. I saw in their eyes a determination I had never seen before. Years of silence had transformed into the strength of solidarity. Under that pressure, I decided to escalate the legal fight. I was no longer content with just suing the HOA for abuse of power. Charles and I expanded the case, formally filing suit against both the HOA and Karen for racial discrimination, violation of property rights, and the misuse of authority for personal gain. We added an array of new evidence: discriminatory policy document, unauthorized fees, and defamatory newsletters. Charles said that once the case was broadened, Karen would be unable to maneuver. The court would no longer be looking at a dispute between one individual and the HOA, but at the entirety of a broken system. When news spread that I was suing both the HOA and Karen directly, the community responded with force. Many came to my house, bringing documents, receipts, and even violation letters they had received in the past. They wanted to help prove this wasn't an isolated matter. I spent night after night organizing stacks of files, realizing that our strength didn't just lie in the law, but in numbers. Piece of paper, each story, was a fragment of truth showing how Karen had turned the HOA into an instrument of oppression. Karen, of course, didn't sit quietly. She continued sending letters, still filled with bitter language and veiled threat. But the more she did it, the angrier the community became. Mrs. Gomez told me that for the first time in years, she no longer feared checking her mailbox each morning. "I know there might be another ridiculous letter in there," she said, "but I'm not afraid anymore, because we're in this together." Mr. Peterson publicly declared that if Karen dared to continue her threats, he would file for a class action suit himself. I realized that never before had this community been so united. Families who once kept their distance now met regularly to discuss and support one another. Younger residents formed online groups to share updates about the case, distributing legal documents so everyone would understand their rights. Even those who used to be shy now spoke up during public meetings. Every word Karen uttered was now challenged, and every HOA decision was scrutinized. I remember a particular moment when Emily came home from school and told me a classmate had said, "My mom says your dad is doing what everyone in the neighborhood has wanted to do, but never had the courage." She beamed with pride, and I saw it in her eyes too. I knew then that I wasn't just fighting for the present, but for my daughter's future, to show her that justice is real if we stay the course. Karen now resembled nothing more than a desperate figure clinging to scraps of power already lost. Threatened to countersue, but no one believed. She shouted about community reputation, but it was the community itself that had risen against her. She spoke of values, but everyone could see the only value she held on to was her personal gain. I sat at my desk, watching the growing stack of files, and I saw clearly, we were no longer on the defensive. We were on the offensive, forcing Karen and the HOA into court to answer for everything. This battle had become more than a simple lawsuit. It was now a symbol of unity and a collective stand against abuse of power. I knew challenges still lay ahead, but with the community behind me, I no longer felt alone. Karen could flailing, threatening, but with every day, she only further destroyed her own credibility. And we, with faith and resolve, would see this through until justice spoke. The day of the public HOA meeting arrived, and the atmosphere in the neighborhood was as tense as a drawn wire. From early morning, I saw groups of residents gathering outside the community hall, speaking in hushed tones, but their eyes gleamed with anticipation. I knew this meeting was no longer a dry annual formality. It had become the moment that would decide the fate of Karen, the HOA, and our entire community. For me, it was also the final chance to expose the truth Karen had worked so hard to bury. As I walked into the hall, I felt every gaze shift toward me. Karen was already seated at the head table, table, folder in front of her, but the confidence she once wore so easily was gone. Around her, a few board members tried to look composed, but their eyes darted nervously whenever residents glanced their way. The room was packed, not a single empty chair remained, and several residents stood along the walls. I had never seen an HOA meeting draw such a crowd, and that alone told me the community was ready to speak. The meeting began with Karen's familiar voice. She tried to keep her composure, read through the agenda, then quickly pivoted to attacking me. She repeated the same tired accusations that I was a source of division, that my lawsuit was destroying the value of the community, that I had damaged Lakeside Heights' reputation. But this time, there were no nods of agreement. People sat still, listening coldly, as if just waiting for their turn to hear the other side. As soon as Karen finished, the presiding judge invited me to speak. I stood up, walked slowly to the podium, carrying the folder I had spent months preparing. I looked around the room, took a deep breath, and began. I didn't come here to divide us. I came here to bring the truth into the light. And today, I will show you the full picture of what's been happening under this HOA's leadership. I opened the folder and held up copies of the documents detailing the illegal fees imposed by the HOA. I pointed out each charge that had been enforced without a single resident vote. Then, I laid out the shady real estate transactions tied to Karen, where homes had been pressured into being sold at low prices and ended up in the hands of companies managed by her and her relatives. I didn't forget to show the defamatory HOA newsletters, nor the blatantly discriminatory regulations. Each page I raised struck like a hammer against the crumbling wall of false authority. The mood in the room shifted visibly. First, residents had listened in silence, but when I read excerpts from the letter Karen sent to the Singh family, laced prejudice, murmurs of outrage swept through the crowd. When I showed the inflated roofing contract that Mr. Peterson was pressured into signing, voices shouted in protest. And when Mrs. Gomez stood up to confirm she had been fined just for hanging flowers during a holiday, the room erupted in applause. I continued, my voice growing firmer with each word. We cannot call this the preservation of community values. This is abuse, manipulation, and a disregard for the dignity of every resident here. And I believe that today, we will choose to be silent no longer. The applause erupted in waves, echoing through the room. I looked around and saw countless faces glowing, relieved that someone had finally voiced what they had been holding inside. Some residents even stood, raising their hands in agreement. Fear that once blanketed the room had vanished, replaced by a spirit of unity, stronger than anything I had ever witnessed before. Karen tried to regain control. She shot to her feet, her voice sharp. Everything he said is a lie. This is a sabotage campaign. But immediately, residents pushed back. One person shouted from the back row, "What about the fees we've been paying?" Another followed, "What about all the ridiculous violation letters?" Outrage surged through the room, and for the first time, Karen had lost control of the very meeting she once treated as her personal stage. She scrambled to defend herself, citing bylaws and claiming every decision was for the greater good. But it was obvious to everyone that those were just excuses. I didn't need to say much more. I let the community question her direct, and with every question, the mask fell further. Karen turned to the board, silently pleading for support, but even they could no longer muster the confidence to stand with her. When the meeting reached the vote of confidence, the atmosphere turned electric. One by one, residents raised their hand, not only rejecting the unjust rules, but also demanding Karen step down. Cries of "enough" rang out from every corner. Karen's face turned pale, her hands trembled, and she had no words left to fight back. I stepped down from the podium and returned to my seat beside Emily. She squeezed my hand tightly, her eyes shining with pride. I knew that moment wasn't just a personal victory. It was proof that when a community stands together, no abuser of power can remain standing. The meeting ended amid excited chatter, but everyone understood that an era had ended. Karen had no way back. She might still flail within the legal system, but her real power in this community had dissolved. As I stepped out of the hall, residents came to shake my hand, pat my back, and even pull me into embraces. They offered thanks, saying that without me, they would still be bowing under pressure. I smiled, but I knew deep down this victory belonged to everyone because I had only been the first to speak. That night, sitting alone on my porch, I retraced the entire journey. From the first violation letters to this very day, so much sweat and pain had been poured out, but in the end, justice had spoken, and I understood, when a community decides it will no longer be afraid, nothing can stand in its way. The lawsuit, which had dragged on for months, finally reached its conclusion. I still remember the moment the judge struck the gavel and delivered the verdict. I had won. The HOA was held accountable for its unlawful actions and ordered to compensate me and the other residents who had endured years of oppression. The evidence presented by me and my attorney, Charles Donovan, from unauthorized fees and shady contracts to heartbreaking testimonies of discrimination, painted a picture that could not be denied. Karen, who once sat in arrogant authority, could only lower her head in silence. The ruling was more than a legal victory. It was a powerful blow to the entire system Karen had built. The court made it clear that the HOA had overstepped its authority, abused its power for manipulation and personal gain, and engaged in discriminatory practices that violated federal civil rights laws. That meant Karen, the mastermind, was immediately removed from her position as HOA president. She was given no chance to make excuses or delay the inevitable. An era of abuse ended before everyone's eyes. The day Karen was officially stripped of power, the entire neighborhood felt like it had awakened. I saw residents gathered outside the hall, chatting excitedly, many of them embracing each other in joy. They no longer had to live in fear of being fined for hanging a flower pot in the wrong place or letting their children play on the lawn. They no longer had to dread opening a letter from the HOA covered in threats. They were finally free from the oppressive shadow that had loomed over them for so long. As for me, once just a lone individual standing up to the HOA, I was now formally entrusted with the task of restoring order in the community. I didn't see it as personal glory but as a serious responsibility. Immediately after the court ruling, I joined a group of resident volunteers to begin repairing the damage left behind. We reviewed all existing regulations, eliminating every unreasonable rule Karen had enforced. The illegal fees were abolished, and a transparent voting process was implemented to ensure that every decision would now be made collectively by the resident. I had no desire to replace Karen with a different form of authoritarianism. I wanted to build a truly democratic model, where every voice mattered. At our new meetings, I invited every resident to speak, to share ideas they had never dared express before. Mrs. Gomez suggested rebuilding the trellis in front of her porch, which she had once been forced to tear down, and the room erupted in applause. The Singh family proposed hosting a small cultural festival, their first chance to openly celebrate their traditions without fear of punishment. Mr. Peterson said he would finally fix his awning the way he wanted, not according to someone else's arbitrary standard. These simple acts were the clearest proof of the freedom we had just claimed. While the community steadily returned to a path of fairness, Karen faced collapse. I heard she attempted to file an appeal, but it was swiftly denied. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. Many of the residents who had once been her closest allies now turned their back, unwilling to be associated with her any longer. The title of HOA president, once feared by all, had become a stain. People no longer looked at Karen with caution, but with contempt. I remember one morning, as I walked past the small neighborhood market, a resident whispered, "It's hard to believe the day finally came. We're free of Karen." I smiled, not out of gloating, but from a deep sense of relief. Karen had dug her own grave with ambition, and her downfall had become inevitable. I received an outpouring of support and respect from the residents like never before. They called me the one who paved the way, the person who helped them reclaim their voice. But I always reminded everyone that this was not my victory alone. Without the courage of the witnesses, without the collective will to stand up, the lawsuit would never have succeeded. I merely lit the spark. The fire of justice was kept alive by the community. Emily, my daughter, was the happiest of all. She had seen me exhausted, had once been afraid every time a letter from the HOA arrived. Now, she looked at me with pride. She said, "Dad, you taught me not to stay silent in the face of injustice. I'll remember that for the rest of my life." I knew that the lesson we had lived through together would stay with her forever, part of her growing up. Since the HOA was restructured, the atmosphere in Lakeside Heights has changed completely. People greeted each other more, gathered to talk without hesitation. Children played in the yards again, their laughter echoing down street that had once fallen silent out of fear of fine. Houses were painted in colors chosen by each family, no longer constrained by meaningless aesthetic standards. Garden corners bloomed once more, reflecting the diversity this community should have always embraced. Fairness and respect returned as core values. No one worried anymore about being forced to change a porch roof, dismantle a trellis, or pay absurd fees. Instead, every decision was discussed openly, democratically, and transparently. People no longer viewed the HOA as a looming power, but as a system that served them exactly as it was meant. Looking back on everything, I see one truth clearly. Fighting for personal rights is not just about protecting oneself, but about clearing the path for an entire community. If I had chosen silence that day, Karen would have continued to rule, and Lakeside Heights would have remained trapped in her grip. Through persistence and belief in justice, the residents and I rewrote the story. On the final night of the lawsuit, I sat on the front porch, moonlight casting its glow over a street that had returned to peace. I thought of Rachel, my wife, who was no longer here to witness this victory. I believed that if she were still alive, she would be smiling with pride. I thought of Emily, of the future she would grow up in a fair community, free from abuse of power. And I thought of all the residents who had stood with me, those who dared to step out of fear. Karen had lost everything, but the community had been reborn. And that was what mattered most. What do you think about fighting for personal right? Leave a comment and share your thought. Karen could not accept. I knew her personality too well, the arrogance and ambition woven into every word, every glance. Karen, power wasn't just a goal. It was a part of her identity, a crutch clung to in order to validate her worth in the eyes of others. That's why, after being stripped of her leadership of the HOA, which she treated like an unshakable throne, she didn't retreat quietly. She lashed out like a cornered animal. I once heard that Karen had submitted an appeal to the court, trying to paint herself as a victim of a personal conspiracy, claiming everything that happened was the result of others plotting against her. The appeal was written in a tone that was both arrogant and desperate, but ultimately, it was quickly dismissed for lacking any legal basis. The court didn't take long to conclude. There was no conspiracy, only the fact Karen had gone too far. Unwilling to surrender, Karen reverted to her old trick. She sought out a few residents who had remained neutral, those who had neither openly supported nor opposed her. Perhaps Karen believed their silence was a sign of weakness, crack she could exploit. She went door to door, offering excuses, even feigning remorse. But this time, the coldness that met her was more telling than open defiance. These people simply shook their head, maintaining polite distance. But in their eyes was a gap that could never be bridged. They no longer wanted any association with someone who had lost all credibility. Karen had become nothing more than a misplaced shadow, wandering the streets she once ruled with a glance, now avoided by all like a stain with no name. I watched all of it with calm detachment, not with glee, not with pity, simply because I understood. This was the inevitable result. Karen could flailing come up with more desperate tact, but the outcome was already set. No one stood with her anymore. Even her closest allies, the ones who once sat beside her in meetings and nodded at every unreasonable directive in exchange for small privileges, now avoided her, because they knew. Siding with Karen now meant dragging their own reputation into the abyss, being seen by the entire community with eyes full of contempt. Karen was no longer the HOA president, but a defeated figure, alone in the very place she once ruled with an iron grip. As Karen's shadow of power slowly withdrew from community life, I knew it was time to start again. No one could do it alone, but someone had to begin. I, along with a group of volunteers, rolled up our sleeves and started rebuilding not just the physical structures, but more importantly, trust. Foundational values like fairness, equality, and mutual respect, once distorted by Karen into tools of control, now had to be restored to their true meaning. We reorganized the community meetings into something genuinely democratic. There were no more shouting matches, no more wary glances, or veiled threat. Instead, there was dialogue, debate, and ultimately, consensus. Everyone was allowed to speak, regardless of age, gender, or past allegiance. Some spoke slowly, some hesitantly, some still with lingering fear, but the important thing was that they had begun to speak. The air no longer felt heavy. I could sense a new heartbeat pulsing through the community, reviving it piece by piece. We also established a communal fund, ensuring absolute transparency. Every expenditure, every source of income was made public before all residents. No one had the right to use it for personal purposes anymore. The fund was used to repair roads, upgrade the park, and support struggling families' practical, tangible thing. I proposed that any financial decision must be discussed openly and passed only by majority vote. What was remarkable was that no one objected. Faces that once bowed in silence under Karen's rule now stepped forward in new roles. Mrs. Gomez, who had always kept her distance for fear of being misunderstood, now confidently took on the role of overseeing public activity, trusted and supported by her neighbor. Mr. Peterson, the man who lived alone at the end of the street, once silent at the back of every meeting, was now an active member of the new administrative board. His deep, steady voice echoed clearly during discussion, a testament to the transformation that had taken root. The atmosphere in the community shifted as well. Families who once lived in fear of absurd, rigid rules could now breathe freely. One young family that had been fined by Karen for letting their children play outside after 6 p.m. now happily shared how their kids could run freely again without fearing judgmental eyes. The Singh family hosted an Indian cultural celebration right in the shared courtyard, inviting the entire neighborhood to join. Music blended with children's laughter. The scent of curry and baked sweets filled the air. No one felt like an outsider anymore. I spent many afternoons walking door to door, listening. Some wanted to plant more flowers at their gates, some wished to repaint their homes, and some simply needed a nod of approval to feel acknowledged. I always said, this is no longer an era of restrictions. Everyone has the right to their own home. That wasn't a slogan, it was a promise. The community was no longer divided. In the past, people looked at each other with suspicion, fearing that one wrong word would be reported. Now, they exchanged morning greetings, shared vegetables from backyard gardens, and offered one another a cup of tea at the corner. Unity didn't come from rallying cries, it came from the smallest act. Those who once hesitated to speak at meetings now volunteer to share opinions, offer feedback, and suggest ideas. They knew their voices mattered. One evening, the entire community gathered to discuss the park renovation project, a space that had once symbolized neglect, now becoming a new emblem of renewal. I stood quietly, looking around at the radiant faces. The laughter mixed with spirited debate. Some proposed building a new playground for the children, others wanted a jogging path, and a few hoped for more benches for the elderly. Every suggestion was heard, and the final decision was a collective blend of all of them, not imposed by anyone, but shaped by everyone. I realized this change didn't come from a single person, but from the community itself. I was merely the one who opened the door. It was the residents who stepped through, who learned to reject silence, to stand up for what is right, to protect one another. And that, above all else, is the greatest achievement. Karen is now just a name occasionally mentioned in conversation, more as a reminder than a resentment. People no longer speak of her with anger, but as a marker of a past best left behind, because it was through the lesson of her abuse of power that Lakeside Heights found the strength to rebuild itself so completely. As night fell, I sat on the porch, watching Emily, my daughter, laughing with her friends, her hair catching the breeze, her voice echoing under the warm glow of the street lamp. I heard neighbors chatting across yards, saw small potted plants set out on porches, quiet signs that life had returned to normal, and I knew we had moved beyond the era of darkness, the time when fear was law. Now, fairness, equality, and mutual respect shine across every rooftop. This community has found itself again, and I believe it will never allow another abuser of power to rise again. When everything had come to a close, I sat alone on the porch, the streetlight casting a glow across the old brick patio, glimmering like fragments of memory that had just passed. The late summer breeze whispered through the trees along the road, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint laughter of children echoing from the park, a place once abandoned under Karen's harsh control, now transformed into the gathering heart of the neighborhood. I looked around, taking in every small detail. The neighbor's door slightly ajar, faint clink of glasses from someone's kitchen, the silhouette of a person strolling leisurely down the sidewalk, and I understood. This was no longer the old Lakeside Height, wrapped in fear and silent. Everything had changed. But what struck me more deeply than the victory itself was the lesson our community and I personally had learned from everything that had happened. I realized this wasn't simply a lawsuit, or a standoff between me and Karen, or a fight over HOA leadership. It was an awakening, a definitive proof of one unshakable truth. We must never stay silent in the face of injustice. For years, living in this neighborhood, I believed that following every rule, even the unreasonable ones, was the price of peace for my family. I thought that if I kept my head down, didn't make waves, didn't resist, Karen would overlook me. I turned away when neighbors were unfairly punished, looked the other way when the elderly woman was chastised for her planter not meeting standard, and I stayed silent when I received a warning letter just because Emily had drawn chalk art on the sidewalk. But over time, I came to see, silence protects no one. It only empowers those who abuse their power, emboldens them, and ultimately turns them into figures others believe cannot be challenged. Karen didn't grow powerful because she was capable. She grew powerful because we allowed her to impose her will, again and again. Each time we said nothing, she stepped further. Her authority didn't come from talent, from our fear. And then, the moment I decided to push back, just one small act, a single refusal, I saw something I had never seen before. Karen losing control. In her eyes, I saw confusion, disbelief, and anger as she realized the world she had built fear had begun to crack. Fracture didn't come from a courtroom or a legal statute, it came from the choice of one ordinary person, me. I understood then that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And in that moment, I knew I could never go back. The greatest lesson I learned was this: you have to speak up. Even when it's hard, even when you're isolated, even when you know you'll be threatened or slandered, you still have to say, enough. Because if you don't, Emily will grow up in a community where children aren't free to play, where adults need permission to plant a flower bed, and where people are disrespected in their own homes. I couldn't let my daughter learn that silence is a way of life. I wanted her to understand that justice doesn't arrive on its own. It's something that must be reclaimed with resolve, voice, with an unyielding spirit. Looking back on the entire journey, one other truth became clearer than ever. Real power doesn't lie in status or wealth. Karen had all of that. She had money, hidden political connections, and people on the board willing to follow her orders just to hold on to some petty privilege. But all of that collapsed the moment the community began to say no. True strength lives in the collective voice. When Mr. Peterson, a quiet man who always sat at the back of meetings, spoke out publicly. When Mrs. Gomez, the one Karen once threatened with legal letters, stood up and proposed reforms to the decision-making process. When the Singh family, once fined for hosting a cultural celebration without prior approval, invited the entire neighborhood to a backyard party without asking anyone's permission. Those actions, seemingly small on their own, built into something unstoppable. For the first time, Karen trembled. The same Karen who could once silence an entire room with a single look was now surrounded by dozens of voices, and in that moment, she was no longer in command. She was just a fallen despot. We didn't win because of me, but because of all of us. I may have been the one to start it, but it was the community that made the change real. I still remember the sound of applause during that public HOA meeting, not as a show of support for me personally, but as a collective declaration. We will not be silent anymore. It was the sound of awakening, of dignity, of defiance that had been buried for too long, and I knew, in that moment, that was the true end of Karen. This fight may be over, but its lesson will stay with us for a long time. I've come to understand that justice isn't some lofty, unreachable ideal. It begins with the smallest thing: the right to paint your fence, color you like, the right to hang a swing in your front yard, the right to live in a community where your voice matters. Freedom isn't an abstract idea, it's the feeling of being respected both in your personal choices and in your shared life with others. When an HOA uses its rules to control. It doesn't just take away property right, it strips away human dignity, and that is something that can never be forgiven. I share this story not to invite sympathy or seek praise. I share it so that those who have ever been pushed into a corner, forced into silence in the very place they call home, will know they are not alone. No one wins a battle alone, but when we stand together, no abuser of power can hold their ground for long. I want this story to serve as a warning that the strength lies in the hands of the community, and it only takes one person to break the silence. If I could do it, then anyone can. I also hope that the next generation children like Emily won't have to learn this lesson the hard way, as we did. I want her to grow up in a world where justice isn't something that needs to be reclaimed, but something that's simply expected. I want her to remember that fairness doesn't appear on its own, but if enough people believe in it, it becomes real. And that is the greatest legacy I can leave behind, not property, but a way of living, the courage to stand up for what's right. Tonight, as I listen to the wind rustling through the trees, the voices of neighbors over the wooden fence, the laughter of children calling to one another in the renovated park, I feel a quiet peace settle inside me. Not because everything is perfect, but because I know this. We dared to say no to injustice. We reclaimed not just the land we live on, but the lives we lead. And that lesson, I believe, will never be forgotten. As this turbulent journey finally came to an end, one thing became clear to me. Justice had at last returned to our community. No longer were unreasonable warning letters slipped under doors as a form of veiled threat. No longer were vague rules imposed arbitrarily and cited as if they were sacred law. Gone were the furtive glances exchanged between neighbors whenever someone mentioned the HOA, as if a single slip of the tongue would land them on a blacklist. That heavy atmosphere had been swept away, placed by a collective sigh of relief that rippled through every home, every street, every garden once scrutinized by Karen and her apparatus of control. Those who had been silenced, who once bowed their heads in quiet resignation, finally reclaimed their freedom, not the abstract kind, but a real, tangible one. Freedom to plant flowers without being reprimanded, to let children play without being penalized, to paint a fence without fearing it might be deemed aesthetic misconduct. These small things, seemingly trivial, were the clearest signs that life had returned. And to me, they were living proof that every sacrifice, every wound endured by myself and others had been worth it. Justice doesn't arrive overnight. It doesn't come just because someone shouts, "This is wrong." It's the result of persistence stretched over months, of late-night meetings charged with tension, of resistance forged in both word and deed. I had to confront Karen head-on, a woman long accustomed to controlling everything with her gaze and her sharp tongue. I walked into courtrooms not only armed with files and evidence, carrying the quiet burden of dozens of families behind me, people too tired or too afraid to stand up for themselves. There were moments I thought I would break. Moments felt like a lone figure, fighting a machine built for intimidation, backed by resources, connections, and experience in silencing dissent. But I did not back down, because I knew that if I fell, no one else would rise. And then, after what felt like endless days, after testimony, rebuttals, and Karen's many attempts to twist the truth, justice finally spoke. The court ordered the HOA to compensate for their overreach, and Karen lost everything: her position and her reputation. The power she once wielded as a weapon to control the community now returned to crush. The name Karen, once enough to silence a room, had become a cautionary tale, a painful memory reminding us all that when power rests in the hands of someone who doesn't know its limits, we all become potential victims. I took no pleasure in her downfall. I felt no triumph, no desire for revenge. Only a cold, simple truth remained, that anyone who disrespects justice must, in the end, bow to it. For me personally, what I gained wasn't just the plot of land I should have always had the right to own. It wasn't just the gate key, a small but found symbol of personal freedom. The real victory was that I, together with the community, reclaimed justice for everyone. In the final meeting after the trial, when I stood before all the residents, I made it clear that this was not my personal triumph. It was the result of unity, of courageous testimony, of people who had once been afraid, but had learned to stand up and say no. I still remember the look in Mrs. Gomez's eyes as I said those words, eyes filled with tears, yet shining with pride. Mr. Peterson, the man who once quietly fixed his awning at night out of fear that Karen might see, nodded at me for the first time, as a friend. Those nods, were the strongest affirmation of all, that from now on, no one could ever take their voice away again. And then, I looked around at the community I had lived in for so many years, yet had never seen so alive. Emily ran through the park with her group of friends, no longer carrying the constant worry that used to cross her face whenever she ran too far. Mrs. Gomez had replanted her trellis in front of her porch, this time with no one asking her to take it down for ruining the aesthetic. Mr. Peterson sat peacefully beneath his own awning, reading a book and sipping tea, his face relaxed as if he had just shed a burden that had weighed on him for far too long. The Singh family, once fined for playing their festival music a bit too loud on the weekend, hosted a small party and invited the entire neighborhood. No one rushed to leave. People raised their glasses together, shared food, told stories, and laughed out loud. Music and laughter blended together, flowing through the street like an anthem, ushering in a new era. I took a deep breath. The breeze carried the scent of fresh bloom, mingled with grass and the aroma of someone's dinner cooking nearby. I felt peace threading its way through every corner of the street, every port, every lighted window. There was no more tense silence, no more wary glances. Only understanding and unity remained. This story, though it has come to a close, will leave its echo behind. It reminds us all that justice is never random. It is the result of persistence, of courage, and most importantly of solidarity. It also proves that power, if not kept in check, transparency and fairness, will always lead to disaster. And above all, it confirms that human dignity, when protected, when upheld by a strong community, will always shine. No matter how long it has been buried under oppression, justice has returned. And this community, after everything, has learned how to stand together, protect one another, and hold on to the freedom we fought so hard to reclaim with every ounce of resolve and belief we had. As I look back on the entire journey I've taken, I realize this story was never just a legal battle with the HOA or a tense confrontation with Karen Wellington. It was a long and difficult path, one in which I had to learn how to stand up after loss, how to defend my dignity, my property, and most importantly, the truth. It all began with small letters that seemed harmless, with absurd rules about paint colors, plants, or even trellises in front of porches. But those small details became the spark for a quiet war. And when Karen crossed the line, erecting a gate, locking off access, turning community rights into personal tools, I knew the time had come for me to firmly resist. I once thought that fighting back was just about protecting my home and land. But the deeper I got, the more I saw that this wasn't the story of one person. It was the shared pain of dozens of families in Lakeside Heights, people who had endured far too long under unchecked authority. The evidence was written all over Mrs. Gomez's eyes when she recounted being fined for hanging flowers, in Mr. Peterson's trembling voice as he remembered paying 3 times the normal cost for an awning, and in the sadness of the Singh family as they were mocked for their cultural tradition. These fragments of individual stories, when pieced together, formed a larger picture of injustice Karen had imposed. What gave me strength wasn't just anger, but the solidarity of the community. For the first time, I saw the silence of many years being broken. People dared to whisper their stories, then dared to speak them aloud, dared to stand up as witnesses. They were the ones who turned my lawsuit into a collective case. They were the ones who transformed the voice of one into the strength of many. That unity was something Karen never anticipated, and it was also what brought her down most swiftly. Looking back, I understand now that justice isn't some distant ideal. It's found in each small, determined act. When I chose to buy back the land and the gate key, it wasn't a show of ego, but a declaration that freedom cannot be locked away. When I brought evidence into court, I wasn't just defending my name, I was clearing a path for others to reclaim their voices. And when the community stood together in that public HOA meeting, it wasn't a spontaneous uprising, it was the result of a long process of rekindling faith and fairness. This battle left me with lessons I will never forget. First is that silence only prolongs the cycle. Many of us once believed that endurance would buy us peace, but the truth is, silence only made Karen stronger. Change only came when someone dared to say, enough. The second lesson is that real power does not lie in the hands of one person or a small group, but in the collective will of a community. Money, titles, and authority may impose themselves for a moment, but when enough people stand together, those things collapse quickly. I also learned that justice is not just a verdict handed down by a court, but a shift in people's awareness. Justice exists when Mrs. Gomez can freely replant her trellis, when the Singh family hosts a cultural festival in shared joy, and when children run freely through the park without their parents fearing fines. Justice is present when every resident can hold their head high, knowing their voice carries weight and will be heard. In the moment Karen stepped down, I didn't see the victory as mine alone, but as the inevitable result of truth. She may have once been powerful, may have made many people bow their head, but she could never win forever while standing on injustice. Karen's downfall was not just the fall of one person, proof of a deeper truth. Those who disregard fairness will ultimately pay the price. This story also left me with a profound faith in the next generation. Emily, my daughter, saw it all. She once trembled when I received threatening letters, and once felt sadness hearing neighbors insulted by Karen, but she also witnessed the day we reclaimed justice. She knows now that truth can be hidden, but it can never be extinguished. I believe that from this point forward, Emily will grow up believing that justice is worth defending, and that courage will always be stronger than fear. As I walk through the streets of Lakeside Heights today, I see that everything has changed. People greet each other with smiles, children play freely, porches glow with bright colors, and trellises bloom with flowers once again. This community has been reborn, no longer overshadowed by the darkness of abuse. And in that peace, I know we've accomplished the most important thing. thing. We've protected the core values of life, fairness, equality, and respect. If there's one final message I want to share, it's this. Never underestimate the power of truth and unity. No matter who you are or where you live, if you are forced to live under injustice, remember that all it takes is one voice to speak up, others will follow. And when enough voices come together, no oppressor can stand. In the end, justice, no matter how late, will always find its way back. That is the end of this story, but also the beginning of a renewed belief. A community is only truly strong when each individual dares to stand up for what is right. And from those struggles, we learn how to preserve dignity not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come.